think we're going to go ahead and get started. I think we've given lots of people time to sort of show up. We're an intimate crowd, but welcome. Great to see you this morning. So I'm Stephanie Clark, for those of you who have not met me, and I'm with our Center for Justice Reform and our National Center on Restorative Justice, and I teach in our Master of Arts in Restorative Justice program, as well as the JD program, and just delighted to have you here. I'm really here in my capacity, though, today as the faculty advisor for the Social Justice Missions Scholars. And what you may or may not know about the scholars is that they are selected based on their experience in social justice, and then specifically also their passion and interest in social justice and public interest initiatives. And so they're a really unique group of students that come here with just this motivation to be a catalyst for change, which is really exciting. What's also really exciting, though, is to share with them the great work that's happening from you, our alumni swans, who are going out and doing this work as lawyers and professionals in all of our areas of, I think, expertise from Vermont Law and Graduate Schools. So all the environmental needs, animal rights, food and agriculture, restorative justice, and so much more. And so we're excited to have our Swan Talk and to invite, in particular, 3 swans who have been nominated for the Social Justice Missions Scholar Alumni Award. And while we can only have one recipient who will receive her award this afternoon, everyone who has been nominated is doing such critical work that really deserves our recognition and amplification. And so it's my great pleasure to get to introduce these swans and to also moderate our conversation and discussion this morning. And I think we get to have a really fun conversation because we are such a nice, small, intimate group, which is great. With that, though, I'm going to start with our first panelist, who is Lindsay Owen, and she's from the JD class of 2013. She is the Executive Director of Disability Rights Vermont. And in her nomination, a colleague shared, she has been a passionate advocate for people with disabilities at a nonprofit for nearly a decade. She understands intersectionality and the various barriers that people with disabilities, especially mental illness and BIPOC and people in poverty, face. She is passionate about this work of social justice. I also have the privilege of knowing Lindsay because she teaches as an adjunct in our restorative justice program. And so Lindsay is joining us by Zoom. And Lindsay, I'll say good morning and I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for this nomination. I was really honored to receive that, and it came at a really good time for me, at a time where I was needing a reminder about how important social justice work is, because it is very difficult work, but it's incredibly rewarding. As Stephanie said, I graduated in 2013. Prior to that, I've always had a passion for working with people with disabilities. I volunteered to help children with disabilities learn how to swim when I was in high school, and then was an assistant teacher out in Arizona working with children on the autism spectrum. Returned to Vermont and was a behavior interventionist at Washington County Mental Health, and felt like I just really wanted to do more. I wanted to help on a broader scale. And so I decided to go to law school, and I found myself at Vermont Law, and was looking for something on disability rights, and there was not anything at the time. So fortunately, I actually did a semester in practice with Disability Rights Vermont and just fell in love with the organization and its mission and the type of work that they do. And I was hired part-time while I finished law school. So I was employed by them before graduation, and then I've been there ever since. And so I started as an advocate before getting my license, and then worked as a staff attorney until becoming executive director just last year. So for those of you who don't know, Disability Rights Vermont is the protection and advocacy agency for the state of Vermont. So we are federally mandated under a number of different legislation that protects people with disabilities. So protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness, protection and advocacy for people with developmental disabilities, and then protection and advocacy for individual rights, which kind of covers every other disability that you can think of. And there are a few other pieces. So we are charged with going into hospitals, going into community settings, anywhere where someone is receiving treatment, and monitoring those facilities or living environments to make sure that people's rights are not being violated or they're not being abused or neglected. And we've got really broad access authority to get into these facilities. We do outreach in prisons. We go to psychiatric units. The work that DRBT does is incredibly important, but what I love most about the organization is the variety of work that we're able to do and the different tools that we rely on to get that job done. We have engaged in a lot of really positive systemic litigation in prison. You know, we've made it so people cannot be disciplined for self-harming behavior. If somebody is in need of hospital level treatment for a psychiatric reason or a mental health crisis, then they're supposed to be moved to a hospital setting within 72 hours, or they need to notify DRBT so that we can work on that case. So we've made a lot of great changes in prison settings. We've done some work through the Human Rights Commission around Olmstead and people being unnecessarily institutionalized for lack of, you know, community resources, for example, so that people can live in the least restrictive setting. And then, as Stephanie mentioned, I also am an adjunct professor at the law school, and that really came about because of where victims were. So we received some grant money to be able to represent victims who have disabilities through the criminal prosecution of their offenders, or to get relief from abuse orders. And that's been incredibly rewarding and very difficult for me. That was the bulk of my work before becoming the executive director. And a lot of that was enforcing the very few rights that victims do have in the state, to either not be subjected to multiple depositions or to not have their mental health records unnecessarily disclosed to the defendant, really based on stereotypes that somehow people with disabilities are less credible than other victims. So it's been amazing. I'm just really passionate about this work. We also go around and do polling place accessibility surveys. So we make sure that people with disabilities have equal access to the electoral process and that they can participate effectively and equally. And I could talk about my work in Disability Rights Vermont all day. I do know that we have got a few other folks that are going to be heard as well. So I don't want to take up too much time. And I will also just plug right now that if people are interested in working for Disability Rights Vermont, we are actually growing our legal team right now and our advocacy team. And I was fortunate enough that during my last semester teaching adversity, trauma, and victimization, that one of my students applied to work at Disability Rights Vermont. And so now she is there, which is really excellent. So I love keeping that connection with the law school going, and would love to see that continue and to get some more swans at DRBT. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. So our next panelist is Will Lowry. He's from the JD class of 2017. He's currently legal counsel at Animal Outlook, and he's advocating and protecting farmed animal rights. He's a gifted advocate with deep humility, and in support of his nomination, a colleague wrote, Will Lowry embodies tireless commitment in his work defending animals who are in dire need of justice. As legal counsel for Animal Outlook, Will identifies countless opportunities to use the law to help animals who are farmed. Despite a legal structure configured to exclude animals' interests from receiving a hearing, let alone justice, Will persists in civil litigation, seeking enforcement of criminal laws and petitioning regulatory agencies at the federal and the state levels. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Will. Welcome, Will.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for having me. I am humbled to be here. I was going to say, I believe I was a part of the very first social justice mission scholar groups not too long ago. I went to law school late in life, and I remember that being a wonderful opportunity. And I think back fondly on the year that or actually 2 years, I was in the accelerated program that I spent with that group. So for the folks in the room that are part of that group, you should be honored and privileged at the opportunity. I did go to Vermont Law School specifically for animal law. So my career path was a little bit different. I worked in the corporate law, completely unrelated to law, and ended up volunteering with a number of animal causes. And at some point later in life, just decided that animal law was the thing that I wanted to do. And so I ended up at Vermont Law School. I'm very grateful that I did. I'm especially happy to see the new animal law program, all the new offerings and the new people that that program is attracting. As far as what I do, I'll kind of speak very briefly to what I do, and then maybe just a couple of points of wisdom that have been helpful for me in my career for any students in the room. So as Stephanie mentioned, I am legal counsel for Animal Outlook. Animal Outlook is a national nonprofit organization, and we focus on farmed animal issues. So I spend my time largely between two areas. The first is litigation, as was mentioned. We have a lot of lawsuits underway regarding a different or a wide variety of theories, and those may range from administrative law. So I'll take the opportunity to plug to any law students who want to do animal law that administrative law is super duper important. I would encourage you to take that. We have lawsuits against the Department of Agriculture. We have pending lawsuits against other government agencies, and these all relate to different rules and regulations that establish the law for how we can treat animals. So they may be slaughter rules, they may be food safety rules. We also do lawsuits related to false advertising. I'm sure people have been in the grocery store and seen pictures of happy cows or the words humane or different certifications. Many of those are very misleading. And so we have lawsuits to try to clarify those things for consumers. We do have lawsuits that are more related to civil enforcement, so trying to enforce various laws that other authorities may not be enforcing. So we do a wide range of things in that area, and obviously the skills that I learned at Vermont Law School are helpful in that regard. The other part of my job, which I very much enjoy, and I was happy to see that Vermont Law School offered a class on this summer, is Undercover Investigations. And so I am the attorney for our investigations department. And I won't go into too many details, but there's a lot of risks that need to be managed. There's a lot of working with law enforcement, prosecutors, sheriff departments, attorney generals to try to enforce the cruelty laws that are so often unenforced. And a lot of our effort is to enforce those against corporations in charge or against the people that are sort of leading organizations that are enabling systematic cruelty to farmed animals. And just sort of two words of wisdom, I was reflecting back briefly on, parts of Vermont Law School that I thought were great opportunities and helped me along. And one of them that I think applies to animal law, but elsewhere, is just sort of the wide range of opportunities that was available. I think back on my time in law school, and one of the things that I loved the most was all of the conferences I could go to, the fact that I could pick topics for my paper, I could enter competitions, I could be part of student groups and organize events. For me, I think it behooved me to take advantage of those, and I would encourage anybody in law school to do so. To some extent, you have a blank canvas in law school where you can craft your experience as you want. That for me has been particularly helpful with animal law. Animal law is not a black and white field. It's not a field where I can go and immediately find a case and say, aha, there's the answer, or figure out a way to protect an animal in court. And so that creativity, that ability to sort of think of new ways to do things and come up with new litigation ideas has been extremely helpful. And I had that opportunity at Vermont Law School, and it certainly carried on into my career. And then the other thing I always tell people, and I think this applies well beyond animal law, is to never lose your passion. I've seen so many people interested in animal law that, sort of got off track, ended up in doing something else, and they never made it back. And I understand that things happen, but I think there's a lot to be said of just knowing what you want to do and sort of going for it with reckless abandon to some regard. And whether it's animal law or some other issue, as we all know, there's no shortage of social justice issues or public interest issues out there to invest time in. And we all know that these groups have limited resources, limited funding. And I think you're in a very privileged place being a law student, being an attorney, and that you have skills and sort of knowledge that others don't have to help. So I guess my two words of wisdom would be take advantage of all the creative opportunities and don't lose your passion. But I appreciate being here, and thank you guys for the opportunity to talk today.
Well, thank you so much. And I love that note about never losing your passion, because I think it's easy for law students in particular to get to law school. And I know I've had a number of students show up in my office that at some point they feel disillusioned with something, whatever that experience is, and finding a way to reignite that passion is just so important. And so thank you for that. So our next speaker is Munonyedi Moon. Is that correct?
Yep.
Clifford from the JD class of 2010. And she is the recipient as selected by our Social Justice Mission Scholars of the Social Justice Mission Scholar Alumni Award that she'll be receiving this afternoon. After graduating, Moon returned to New York City, where she's been serving her community, particularly with housing, and she is now the Director of Housing with the Legal Aid Society in New York. In support of her nomination, a colleague shared. Moon's dedication to her clients and work to increase access to justice for vulnerable communities has prevented the eviction and displacement of thousands of low-income New Yorkers. Moon's work for housing justice is entwined with the movement for racial justice, as a disproportionate number of New Yorkers facing eviction are from communities of color. Moon also brings to everything that she does skill, intellect, professionalism, kindness, steadiness, and good humor. I think these human attributes are just so critical for doing social justice work. Moon, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day to have conversations with us today. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much, Social Justice Mission Scholars. And I feel like I'm in such good company with Will and Lauren. So thank you so much. So I'm not even sure where to begin. So I graduated law school in 2010 during what felt like a very challenging time to have, graduated with a lot of debt and like a law degree and not really having a job. And I started my path to housing work by volunteering at the Bedford-Stuyvesant Legal Services office. A friend of mine had worked at Bed-Stuy Legal Services and said, I'm gonna go see my mentor, come along. And I came along and I was having a conversation with his mentor. And I was just fascinated by the work he was describing. He was, telling me about going to court every day and like standing shoulders to shoulder with like, people who are on the verge of eviction, like low income people, just people without any recourse, or people who without his advocacy wouldn't really be getting any kind of semblance of justice in court. And I said, you know what, that sounds like something that I would like to do. And from that day forward, I think I was just kind of like hooked. So the Legal Aid Society is the oldest and largest provider of civil legal services in New York. It's a pretty big organization. We do criminal work and civil work, but housing, is part of the civil practice. And within the housing practice, we also have other little tentacles. We have the law reform unit, which does more like impact litigation. And then we have the program, which I'm the director of, which is the Right to Counsel program. New York was one of the first jurisdictions to pass a right to counsel law in housing. And many states, including Massachusetts, are looking to New York as an example of what this would look like. So in New York, if you get sued by your landlord, you have the right to an attorney if you qualify and are eligible for our services. There's no shortage of tenants being sued in New York. The vacancy rate right now in New York is like 2%. There's really no affordable housing, but there is a decent amount of rent regulated and rent stabilized housing stock, which a lot of the clients we serve live in rent stabilized apartments. And the rents, thankfully, are regulated by an agency called the Rent Guidelines Board, but even those rents are pretty high and pretty unaffordable on a lot of people's income. I think New York is probably one of the most rent burdened states in the country, with people paying an average of 50% of their income towards their rent. So it's interesting. The pandemic really has kind of exacerbated the problems that a lot of our clients face. So right now we have a lot of clients, in court who have a lot of mental health issues, and the way the program is funded now, we don't necessarily have all the resources to provide holistic services for all of the clients. But, we are out there and we're doing what we can. We need more lawyers doing this type of work. So I'm really glad that there is, a program like the Social Justice Mission Scholars Program at Vermont Law School that would encourage the students to take this career path when it comes to becoming a public interest attorney. I think, I could keep talking more about the substance of my work, but in terms of, really needing passion to stay in this work, I started out as a staff attorney in the housing unit, and then I became a supervisor in the housing unit. And then, the weight of the work kind of gets to you. And I was like, okay, you know what? What else is out there? So after about 7-8 years, I went over to the New York City Law Department, and I was there doing discovery work for, what were they called now? Can't remember the special name they were called. But anyway, I was one of the attorneys tasked with doing discovery work for the city. So if you like tripped and fell on the sidewalk and you sued the city, I would assist the attorneys with like coming up with relevant documents. And I was like housed in the Department of Transportation. And I learned a lot about bridges and sidewalks and, you know, what is a pothole? And I would write affidavits for people basically to kind of try to get the city out of trouble. And I was like, what am I doing? This isn't what I wanted. So for me, I think that was something that redirected me and redirected my energy and focus back to doing something that really felt fulfilling for me. So I went back to, doing housing work at Legal Services NYC, which is another legal services provider in New York. I was there for a while in Queens, doing housing work in Queens. And then the office where I started as a staff attorney reached out to me about the director position. And I was like, what? I'd be my boss's boss. That's so strange. And my boss is, my former boss, just a super knowledgeable woman who's been doing this work for 40 plus years. So she's more like a collaborator and a partner. I'm not her boss. I don't think I'll ever be her boss. So right now we all work together. I think the most challenging part of the work right now is with the pandemic, the court, the housing court, which I will talk about later. My second talk. The housing court is, I could talk about housing court all day. I was gobsmacked the first time I went to housing court, and it was Brooklyn Housing Court. It just seems like a forgotten about court where anyone can just kind of get away with whatever they want to get away with. It seemed to me like just like a wild, wild west. I was like, this person is a lawyer? When I was talking to my adversary about any particular case, I was shocked. I was like, this person is not a lawyer, but that person was a lawyer, and that person looked at me and my client like we were dirt and just literally people getting in the way of collecting rent. So housing court, when it was founded, was basically for people to get repairs done to their apartments. But over the course of its 40 plus years, it's evolved into kind of like a collection mill for landlords. And often the worst actors, people living in dilapidated apartments get sued for rent. And, the landlord just says, give me my money. But you're like, but I literally live with like no working oven, no, I don't have water. I don't have running water. And to me, it just seemed like the court would give the landlord a judgment, which is like an award, for the money that you owe. And if you don't pay the money, the landlord has a warrant to evict you. So I saw part of my job when I started out as a staff attorney as like really grinding the whole system to a halt. And I think that's really what we're still doing now because, New York is one of the most tenant-friendly states in terms of like the laws on the books, but in practice, it's challenging. So a lot of us are out there really just gumming up the machinery at this point. But yeah, no, I feel like I'm really glad I went to law school because I feel like it gave me the tools to really try to affect the kind of change I wanted to see in my community. When you were saying that one of the people who nominated me said I'd, helped in stopping the eviction of like thousands of New Yorkers. I was like, well, if you like add it up over however many years I think during the practice, that's insane. But that's really, humbling to hear. And I'm so happy to do what I do. And I feel very fortunate to do what I do. And I would just say, if, any law students end up listening to this, take a clinic, get out there and like really do the work, because I don't think that you have a sense of what the work actually is until you start doing it. When I was in law school, I wanted to do public interest. I didn't necessarily know what that meant until I, started doing internships and clinics and like volunteering where I started working. But yeah, we need more public interest attorneys for sure. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
I'll probably have you not go too far
Okay.
because we are also now, thank you so much, Moon. And it is, it's inspirational to hear you speak about working with these people that, are faced with no running water and, being told they have to pay their rent. It really is mind blowing. And thanks also Will and Lindsay, because all the work that you're doing is just, tremendous. And I think for my own opinion, we're at this strange place of really, really needing to reconnect our humanity in our laws and practice. And of course, I'm a huge fan of doing that in a restorative way. But we need fierce advocates too, right? Fierce advocacy is also part of that. So thank you all so very, very much. I am going to open it up really to a conversation. We have time for some questions and some just reflections. So first I'll just see, do people have some questions? Yeah, Delcy.
First of all, thank you all. You're all doing amazing work, and I'm already really proud of VLS and its alums, but this makes me feel even more proud. I direct our animal law program, so my questions are going to be animal related. I have a question for, sorry, I didn't catch your name. Moon. So one of the leading reasons animals end up in shelters is because of housing issues, and we also are seeing that things like size restrictions and breed restrictions have disparate socioeconomic impacts. And so I'm interested to hear if that's something that you've encountered in your work, and if you have thoughts on that, and maybe specifically what policy reforms you think we should be looking at. And I have a question for Will as well, but I can hold that.
Yeah. So I think animals come into play quite a bit in the work that we do, but oftentimes it's because the landlord is seeking to evict someone for violating like a no pet clause in the lease. Unless you live in a housing that's like regulated by some form of federal or state regulation, I think it's kind of like a free market, and the landlord can like negotiate whatever lease he wants with you and can put restrictions on, having animals or things like that. The other way animals come into play again is if the landlord's again trying to evict you because you have 10 cats or 20. I think I had a colleague who had 20 turtles as a client had 20 turtles or something like that. But I never, to be quite honest, thought about what happened to the animals after the owner gets taken away, or loses their home and becomes homeless. I would imagine they would end up in shelters or hopefully no-kill shelters, but I don't know that there's any we don't. Helene actually did the same work I did for many, many years. Do you know what happened to animals?
I think we would spend time potentially trying to work in the person's networks if people could take things, because obviously, I think I maybe saw this more because when I did housing, it was for folks who are HIV positive, that there was a lot of emotional support animals. And so we would be able to negotiate a certain amount, but sometimes it would mean though it wouldn't be all the animals if there were a lot. And so, which was very distressful and upsetting. So it just became a kind of, or getting somebody help who maybe wasn't up to caring for their animal, but did need them to have the emotional support. So making sure they had home services so that some of that could get taken care of. But definitely for me, the mental health and emotional support was where I would see it most. And we could be, successful. I think that's probably the most kind of successful you can be to get around a lease.
Yeah, and on the lease issue, it's 4 or 6 months. If you had the animal open, and notoriously the landlord can't now come and try to evict you for that.
Yeah. Did you have a follow-up question then for Will?
Yeah, so Will, thank you. And thank you for your work you do and for being an amazing mentor to our students. I'm interested in your thoughts. There's been, as you know, and you kind of overheard me chatting with Stephanie about at the beginning, a critique in recent years of animal advocates' focus on carceral pathways. And some of your work and Animal Outlook's work is focused on pursuing criminal prosecution for abusers, institutional abusers of animals raised for food. And there's a lot of discussion and interest within animal law and within VLS about the relationship between restorative justice and animal law. And our students are asking lots of provocative questions, and we're hosting an online symposium next month to talk about some of this. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether we should be looking at non-carceral approaches, and maybe how this question plays out, particularly in the context of animals used for food.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, Delcy. There's a lot packed into the question. I'll give sort of my 2 cents, but I think this is something, as you well know, has been discussed exhaustively. And I think my first point would be that it should continue to be discussed. I think there's a ton to unpack there. There's a lot of sort of interdependencies. I think here's my take on it. A lot of the sentiment that I have heard is sort of along the lines of we should not be using criminal laws for animals, period, end of story. And a lot of that sort of bases around, the argument that, if we do that, we end up just hurting people. We target individual people. We sort of foster this larger system of oppression. And a lot of those discussions and critiques really come up in the companion animal world. I think my general perspective is I think we should talk about that, but I don't think that we should fully abandon the use of criminal law as it relates to animals. And I'll give you a good example, which Delcy, I know you're familiar with. And so we had a case in Pennsylvania against a industrial dairy with over 1,000 dairy cows that we have pursued cruelty charges for probably 2.5 years at this point. We recently got a decision from the appellate court in Pennsylvania that really hones in on, in the world of animals, what's called common practices. And so for those not in the animal world, this essentially means that there are common practices that a farm can do to an animal used in agriculture that if you did that to a dog or a cat, it would be cruelty, but not for animals used in agriculture. And so we were able to get an opinion that focused on that, and I think provided benefits, not just for that case, but now we have an appellate opinion that is valid law for the 300 million farmed animals across the state of Pennsylvania that now provides them some more protections. And so, I would point that out as sort of an example of the ability to make larger systematic change through cruelty laws. I think a lot of what we are trying to do is focus less on individuals and focus more on corporations. So the Tysons, the Smithfields, the Hormels that are driving some of this institutionalized cruelty. And by abandoning those laws completely, we can't even drive accountability at the highest level. All of that said, I think there's still, opportunity for discussion. There's a lot of groups with very smart people that are kicking this issue around and trying to figure out, if we do pursue this, how do we make it less negative for people, or how do we not have adverse effects like people getting deported or fostering systems of cruelty where you may have people that can't get another job besides working in a slaughterhouse. Do we really want to punish those people? And I think those are valid risks, but I don't think that we should abandon cruelty laws altogether. We have very limited tools to protect animals. I think it's one of them. I think we should be thoughtful about how we use them strategically, but not just give them up entirely.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I think, again, thank you everyone for your work. It's really amazing to hear about it. And I guess I'm interested just at this time, it's a sort of interesting time for public interest law, especially direct service, because of success of, New York with right to counsel and other things. There's actually a lot of work for public interest attorneys who want to do work out of law school in a way that I don't think there has been in 15 years I've been out of law school, which is really great. But it also means, there's a lot of options. So sometimes there's so many options, like what are you going to do? And I know at VLS too, there's a lot of interest in policy, and I certainly was interested in policy and have been able to do policy work. But I'd be really interested in folks' take on the sort of on the front lines working directly with clients, how that potentially leads to policy. How has that informed your ability to work on policy and bigger picture issues? Because I think that's a really important part that I don't know people until they've gone through it really understand. So that's kind of my question, is just that direct representation. How does that potentially lead to ability to advocate for policy? And do you think there's an enhancement to that in your ability to advocate for policy?
That's a great question. And Will and Lindsay, I hope, did you hear the question okay?
Yes.
Okay, and I think we can maybe ask all three of you to respond if that's all right. Lindsay, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So that's absolutely how our policy work happens at Disability Rights Vermont. I mean, we so for example, we do our outreach in the psychiatric facilities, and we'll meet individuals who have been there for months and say, I don't need to be here, but there's no place for me to go in the community. There's not a service provider to meet my needs. I don't have a counselor. And so they're stuck in a really expensive place for the state, and it would be way more cost effective and just more humane and dignifying and respectful to treat that person in the community. And we see this, several people in this situation every time we do outreach. And so then we're starting to think, okay, how do we, because then we'll bring that case to the Human Rights Commission, for example, and maybe we'll be successful and they'll say, yes, this person's rights were violated. What I've seen happen through that process, though, is sometimes we'll file that Human Rights Commission complaint, and then all of a sudden the state has found the money for this person to be in the community, and they release him. And so then the case is moot, and then we have to start all over. So there really is that we see these individual cases and we do this direct work, and then it really informs, like, okay, how do we attack this at a larger level? Like, what kind of advocacy do we need to do with the legislature? And I'm currently acting as the vice president for the Vermont Coalition for Disability Rights. And so we do a platform every year to kind of highlight what the big needs are for change in the system. And housing has been on our platform forever. And it really ties into people's right to live in the least restrictive setting. And so, that's one example. And if people are familiar with like the Olmstead decision, which is about the integration mandate of the ADA, like that is something that we've really been trying to work on a larger level, both public policy wise and to the extent that Vermont's already required to do these things, because they are, we might also have to couple that with litigation. But we definitely use the work that we're seeing on the ground to inform, what we need to advocate for. And we use people's stories if they are willing to have us do that, or we just try and use the numbers and we use our data to say, like, we've worked with this number of people in the last year who are stuck for no reason other than we aren't providing appropriate services in the community. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Moon, can we turn to you next?
Sure. I think that's a really great point you just raised, Lindsay, that the direct representation informs the policy work. I feel like when I was a law student, I wanted to do international human rights law. I wanted to do a lot of, sexy policy work. But I think that in order for any policies to be effective, or the policymakers to be effective at that, they have to understand what happens on the ground. And the unfortunate reality is that there's not too much time to always look at the bigger picture because you're too busy triaging the immediate problems that your clients have. Luckily, at Legal Aid, we do have a branch, that the Law Reform Unit, that does do a lot of policy work. So while we have an army of people working on the direct representation stuff, we have some people who have a little bit of a bird's eye view who can inform the policy work that Legal Aid does. So for instance, the federal government had the emergency rental assistance program. They gave New York State a bunch of money to dispense, these funds so people could stay in their homes over the course of the pandemic, and the money ran out, right? Part of the protections under this, it was called the ERAP program, is that once you apply, your housing court case automatically gets stayed. So the money runs out and the landlords are like chomping in the bit, and they're like, the money is run out. Like, why did you apply? There is no money for you to have. So the Law Reform Unit brought litigation seeking a temporary restraining order to stop the city from, closing the portal so people could continue to apply with the hopes that like new money will come. A large part of our work right now, unfortunately, is defending these motions to vacate these ERAP stays based on, a number of different reasons. But for the people on the ground applying for this emergency rental vouchers for folks and seeing that in housing court, the landlords are moving to vacate the stay, the Law Reform Unit was told about it, and then they brought the litigation, and we still have the TRO in place, and we're still, working on all these motions every day. But yeah, the direct representation work definitely informs the policy work. And I think that for anyone thinking about doing policy work in the future, I think it would be a misstep to not start with doing, direct representation work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We'll turn to you now too.
Yeah, I think my perspective is a little different because I don't have clients that I can speak to or talk to. I mean, my clients essentially are the pig on shackles at the slaughter line or a cow attached to milking equipment. So it's not like I can, speak to them and gain policy information. To me, just a few things to say. I would say that to me emphasizes the importance of some of the work that we do around investigations. I mean, there's such an effort to keep things related to industrial agriculture hidden behind the scenes, and our ability to see that can then sort of lead to some of this policy work. We don't do a ton of policy work, but I think our perspective is finding opportunities where we might strategically be able to alleviate the most suffering or potentially set the foundation for litigation. So, for us, we can't talk to the animals. We make every effort to see through investigations, through public records requests, and gain insight into what's happening, where there might be opportunities, and drive our policy work from that. We do limited policy work, but like I said, we try to do it where it will have the most strategic impact. We have some policy work in Maine that came from one of our investigations at an aquaculture facility. We saw a gap in administrative oversight for the welfare of fish, and so we enacted that. But again, that wasn't from speaking to any salmon at the hatchery. It was from watching the cruelty inflicted on them. So we don't do a ton. I think our perspective is a little different, but for us, it's about finding those opportunities from the information we have and trying to strategically pinpoint where policies may help animals from suffering.
Thank you.
Stephanie, do you mind if I just kind of jump back in? Because something that Moon
Please.
said made me just want to add to that. And I think not only does it really inform our policy work, but I think it's also important to make sure that, because if you don't do the direct work, you may not fully understand the picture. And Moon was saying, you got to like be on the grounds and see what's happening. And I cannot agree with that more, because, Vermont has a lot of statutes on the books that sound great. And, but then they're just not enforced. And in practice, it really doesn't shake out like that. And I see a lot of issues with victims' rights, but then also in our housing realm. And I think it's just critical to make sure that you really understand how things are playing out. And you can only really do that by seeing the animals or seeing the people and seeing the process that's actually unfolding. And I think it's also really important to get like stakeholder input. That's something that we do a lot of, to make sure that we don't advocate for a policy that's going to have unintended consequences that impact particular population that we hadn't even really thought about, because the issue is X, and then all of a sudden if we do that, it's going to maybe cause Y to happen somewhere else. And I think bringing the individual clients into that discussion and just members of the community is just such a huge benefit and a really valuable part of the process to informing public policy. It's not as simple as this would be great, but because I think you do have to take in everybody's perspective. And it was one individual case of self-harm in the prison setting where the individual was segregated that led to I believe a statutory change around not allowing that to happen anymore, where someone cannot be disciplined because of a self-harming behavior. So thank you. Sorry, I jumped back in.
No, that's totally fine. Thank you. I kind of have a follow-up question, but I want to see if there's another question first. I don't want to. So I guess my follow-up question for all of you would be, what is the greatest need, policy or otherwise, in your particular field and practice right now? I mean, if you could, get one thing granted for, improvement, what would that be? Moon, you want to go first?
Oh my God, that's one of the most difficult questions I've actually ever gotten asked. I would, oh my God, if there was one thing, I guess for me, in the top of my mind is that the conversation about the right to counsel just centers around attorneys. And it's a controversial thing to say, but lawyers don't solve everything, and I think in order for the right to counsel to be effective, it needs to include all these other services that clients need, right? Housing is never the only problem that any one of our clients have, So in order for the right to counsel to really be meaningful, I think it has to include a whole slew of supportive services that it currently does not include. Right now, we're building an army of, fierce advocates who get out there and want to, do the right thing by their client, but they have limited tools in the form that where, the law sometimes is kind of like a blunt instrument, that it's not the only solution that will solve people's problems. So I think more resources that aren't just legal resources would be instrumental.
Yeah, it's, lawyers don't solve all problems, and if someone is seeing a lawyer, that means they probably have many needs.
Right.
Yeah, how do we meet those needs? Yeah. Will, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that would be great on behalf of animals. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind is, and this is obviously a large one, is that there is so much support from the government, the federal government, to industrial animal agriculture. It makes for a very steep slope for attorneys and advocates like myself and like Delcy. I mean, the system is skewed towards using and consuming animals, and in most cases in a way that is just horrific. There are subsidies given, there are funds given for mass depopulations of animals to reimburse. We have a case going up to the Supreme Court later this fall on California's Proposition 12, which is a very sort of, modest anti-confinement bill to prevent animals from being kept in gestation crates or veal crates. And, we have the federal government supporting the challenge to that. And so at a very, very high level, if I could pull one lever, I would pull back on some of the deeply embedded support from the government for things that exploit and cause cruelty to animals.
Thank you so much, Will. Lindsay, I'll turn to you.
That is a really, really difficult question to choose just one thing. And policy wise, I mean, if I could choose one action step for Vermont to take, it would be just to follow the law that exists. But short of that, in our office right now, I mean, the biggest need that I see, and I think that it really intersects with housing issues. I mean, I know that it does. We're working potentially on a larger litigation case right now, but I think services in the community and really forcing the state of Vermont to be funding like what we say we value, which is that people can live in their homes, they can live in their communities, and they can access all the services that they need. And so, if I could advocate for one particular policy, it would be the shift in budgeting for institutionalized care and really making sure that there are housing resources in the community, that there are mental health services, that people have access to like their general care providers, that there's, I'm not sure I would get this all in one thing, but like better public transportation, because transportation is a huge barrier for people getting the services that they need, and just a more robust system to help people in a proactive way and not wait for people to be in such a state of need that we're responding to a crisis, because that's kind of how Vermont is operating right now, is that we are funding these really expensive and alternative treatment places where if we just started working with people and working with children and providing services up front and funding what's really important, we're going to prevent people from needing the institutionalized care that people keep talking about. Like, we need more beds. So I think like that would be my dream, is that Vermont really shifts its focus and really starts funding things in a proactive way and upfront.
Thank you so much. So we have just a few minutes left. Other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
So I just have a question for you, and I'm just curious sort of like what your relationship is maybe between like what you're doing in the public realm and the private realm, and how their response is being. For example, I'm thinking for like either public-private partnerships or things like activist shareholders that are they're seeing what you're doing maybe and trying to force the private realm to act, or things like with the ESG standard, just things like that. If you're seeing that in your work.
Do you want to direct that to anyone or all?
I was thinking maybe it might maybe apply to Will, but I also am very curious if it applies with Lindsay or Moon as well.
Can you, I'm not sure I caught the question entirely. Can you reframe it for me?
No problem. Sorry, that was a little scattered. I haven't had enough coffee yet. So I'm curious, sort of, if you have a relationship with the private realm, or if you're seeing the public's influence on the private realm. For example, I'm thinking activist shareholders or the environmental social governance sort of standards that the public or shareholders are putting pressure on the private realm to act, or if you're kind of working on partnerships in the private realm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different lenses to that. So, you know, a lot of our interaction, and hopefully this partly answers the question, a lot of our interaction with the private realm is directed at sort of private consumers and purchasing products. And so I mentioned something earlier about false advertising, labels on cases. So, you know, from a directing at private parties, yes, we sue the government, yes, we sue factory farms, but we also try to do a lot of education to consumers, and that's a big portion of our videos. You mentioned activist shareholders. That's definitely something that we've explored. I'll give a shout out to a friend of mine, Aline at Legal Impact for Chickens, who just filed a shareholder case against Costco related to their animal cruelty. I think that's a great example of somebody using activist shareholders to try to force a corporation to change their practices. We've explored some stuff like that in a different area, not related to chickens, but it's definitely something that we would be interested in if we could find the right fact pattern. So, you know, I can't give you a cohesive strategy, but yes, we focus on private individuals, changing their behaviors directly, or also trying to figure out a way that we can work with them to force corporations to change practices. The other thing that comes to mind is we are, you know, part of a class action lawsuit that I can't speak in too much detail, but that relates to a large mass of consumers that were basically deceived with false advertising. That's another vehicle to take a body of sort of disgruntled consumers and change or force corporations to change.
Anything, Moon, that you would add from your work?
I think in our practice, it's about putting a lot of pressure on like the institutional actors. So to the extent we target private landlords that own big buildings, we can like partner with the AG's office and say, we see a pattern that this particular landlord keeps demanding money that's not owed because we have a class of clients who paid all of their rent and they keep getting sued in housing court. Or this particular landlord keeps suing clients that have a particular subsidy. Let's do something about that. So it is a lot of pressure on working with institutions to put pressure on private actors. We do a lot of. We also work with a lot of coalitions, like the Right to Counsel Coalition. Without them, like the Right to Counsel law would probably never have really gotten passed. You know, it wasn't a bunch of lawyers. It was like a coalition of like real tenants, organizers, you know, and other housing advocates that really put a lot of pressure on the system to really get this law. But yeah.
Wow, thank you. Lindsay, anything that you'd like to add?
You know, I think it's similar to Moon. A lot of our work is done kind of in the public realm and working like bigger picture and trying to have like a systemic impact and address harm that's oftentimes done by the state. But, you know, we absolutely will work and advocate for issues that arise in like the private sector. And I think that happens more so in housing situations, and then like private hospitals as well. You know, we've had some issues there where people kind of have a pattern of discriminating against a particular type of disability, and you know, we do spend a lot of time trying to collaborate as well. And we do that mostly with, you know, we try to do that with like the Department of Mental Health or the Department of Corrections and things like that. So it's not all adversarial, but I think we're mostly working with, in the public realm.
It's awesome to meet co-counsel.
This is Frankie. She actually has been on Zoom since she was a week old. Teaching.
I remember.
Teaching.
Hi.
You say hi to everybody.
Hi.
Now she's quiet. Okay.
Well, and I think actually she got the last word. So I do want to say we are out of time, but I want to say thank you to our nominees and award winner. So Lindsay, Will, and Moon, thank you so much for sharing your time and words of wisdom with us and our social justice mission scholars. And I also just want to let people know, so Moon will be receiving the award this afternoon at the award ceremony. That's at 2:00. It will be out back behind Debevoise. And then at 10:30, I hope to see you at the State of VLS, and that's going to be in Oaks 12. So we have a little bit of a break, and then I hope to see you at 10:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Thank you.